Hi everyone. I just recorded a video for my channel and it just got erased. So this is my second attempt and I hope it works out this time. I'm just, today I just wanted to update about all the stuff that I've been reading lately. I didn't update for a while because I actually haven't really been that inspired by most of the stuff I've been reading. So I think I've just sort of been putting it off. But I wanted to update everyone on what I've been up to and also that way I think I can just get some forward momentum on some other videos that I have in the hopper that I'm a lot more excited about. So I did finish the Strawson, and I actually really liked it. But I think I'm going to save that for a separate video just because I think it's kind of a little bit specialized. I don't think everyone wants to hear about Strawson. And also it's just, I have a lot to say about it and I didn't want it to get lost in a general review video. And also another book I had in the hopper was Paul at the Accidental Bookseller. I haven't forgotten. I do intend to make a video about annotations and annotating books. So those are two things I have in the future. And I just wanted to sort of get through these books that I've been reading just to kind of wrap up things on these books so we can move forward. And yeah, I think I always forget to say this in the videos, but I always in the description put timestamps so that you can fast forward to whatever books interest you. I don't expect everyone to be equally interested in everything I read, especially when I'm going over multiple books. So to get things started off, I did want to start with a piece that I really liked that I read, which was a short essay or kind of like thought experiment entitled Where Am I by Daniel Dennett. And it kind of explores, sort of personhood, identity, fission in a way, and where we conceive of ourselves as existing. And it's a really short piece. You can read it, I don't know, in maybe 20 minutes or something, but it's really fun. It's funny. And I thought it's a really good example of fun, playful, but philosophically interesting writing. And it's part of why I love thought experiments so much. And since it's so short, I did want to read just a small excerpt from it just to whet your appetite, maybe get you interested in reading it. And if you are interested in reading it, in the description, I'll put a link to the entire piece. But just to get people sort of on board and interested in reading, I thought I'd read just the beginning of it. So this was a piece Dennett wrote sometime in the mid-70s. And it begins with, now that I've won my suit under the Freedom of Information Act, I'm at liberty to reveal for the first time a curious episode in my life that may be of interest not only to those engaged in research in the philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and neuroscience, but also to the general public. Several years ago, I was approached by Pentagon officials who asked me to volunteer for a highly dangerous and secret mission. In collaboration with NASA and Howard Hughes, the Department of Defense was spending billions to develop a supersonic tunneling underground device, or STUD. It was supposed to tunnel through the Earth's core at great speed and deliver a specially designed atomic warhead right up the Red's missile silos, as one of the Pentagon brass put it. The problem was that in an early test, they had succeeded in lodging a warhead about a mile deep under Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they wanted me to retrieve it for them. Why me? I asked. Well, the mission involves some pioneering applications of current brain research, and they had heard of my interest in brains, and of course, my Faustian curiosity and great courage and so forth. Well, how could I refuse? The difficulty that brought the Pentagon to my door was that the device I'd been asked to recover was fiercely radioactive in a new way. According to monitoring instruments, something about the nature of the device and its complex interactions with pockets of material deep in the earth had produced radiation that could cause severe abnormalities in certain tissues of the brain. No way had been found to shield the brain from these deadly rays, which were apparently harmless to other tissues and organs of the body. So it had been decided that the person sent to recover the device should leave his brain behind. It it would be kept in a safe place where it could execute its normal control functions by elaborate radio links. Would I submit to a surgical procedure that would completely remove my brain, which would then be placed in a life support system at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston? Each input and output pathway, as it was severed, would be restored by a pair of micro-miniaturized radio transceivers, one attached precisely to the brain, the other to the nerve stumps in the empty cranium. No information would be lost. All the connectivity would be preserved. At first, I was a bit reluctant. Would it really work? The Houston brain surgeons encouraged me. Think of it, they said, as a mere stretching of the nerves. If your brain were just moved over an inch in your skull, that would not alter or impair your mind. We're simply going to make the nerves indefinitely elastic by splicing radio links into them. I was shown around the life support lab in Houston and saw the sparkling new vat in which my brain would be placed were I to agree. I met the large and brilliant support team of neurologists, hematologists, biophysicists, and electrical engineers, and after several days of discussions and demonstrations, I agreed to give it a try. I was subjected to an enormous array of blood tests, brain scans, experiments, interviews, and the like. They took down my autobiography at great length, recorded tedious lists of my beliefs, hopes, fears, and tastes. They even listed my favorite stereo recordings and gave me a crash session of psychoanalysis. The day for surgery arrived at last, and of course I was anesthetized and remember nothing of the operation itself. When I came out of anesthesia, I opened my eyes, looked around, and asked the inevitable, the traditional, the lamentably hackneyed post-operative question, where am I? The nurse smiled down at me. You're in Houston, she said, and I reflected that this still had a good chance of being the truth, one way or another. She handed me a mirror. Sure enough, there were the tiny antennae poking up through their titanium ports cemented into my skull. I gather the operation was a success, I said. I want to go see my brain. They led me, I was a bit dizzy and unsteady, down a long corridor and into the life support lab. A cheer went up from the assembled support team, and I responded with what I hoped was a jaunty salute. Still feeling lightheaded, I was helped over to the life support vat. I peered through the glass. There, floating in what looked like ginger ale, was undeniably a human brain, though it was almost covered with printed circuit chips, plastic tubules, electrodes, and other paraphernalia. Is that mine? I asked. Hit the output transmitter switch there on the side of the vat and see for yourself, the project director replied. I moved the switch to off and immediately slumped, groggy and nauseated, into the arms of the technicians, one of whom kindly restored the switch to its on position. While I recovered my equilibrium and composure, I thought to myself, well, here I am, sitting on a folding chair, staring through a piece of plate glass at my own brain. But wait, I said to myself, shouldn't I have thought, here I am, suspended in bubbling fluid, being stared at by my own eyes? I tried to think this latter thought. I tried to project it into the tank, offering it hopefully to my brain, but I failed to carry off the exercise with any conviction. I tried again. Here am I, Daniel Dennett, suspended in a bubbling fluid, being stared at by my own eyes. No, it just didn't work. Most puzzling and confusing. Being a philosopher of firm physicalist conviction, I believed unswervingly that the tokening of my thoughts was occurring somewhere in my brain. Yet, when I thought, here I am, where the thought occurred to me was here, outside the vat, where I, Dennett, was standing staring at my brain. I tried and tried to think myself into the vat, but to no avail. I tried to build up to the task by doing mental exercises. I thought to myself, the sun is shining over there, 5 times in rapid succession, each time mentally ascending a different place. In order, the sunlit corner of the lab, the visible front lawn of the hospital, Houston, Mars, and Jupiter. I found I had little difficulty in getting my theirs to hop all over the celestial map with their proper references. I could loft a there in an instant through the farthest reaches of space, and then aimed the next there with pinpoint accuracy at the upper left quadrant of a freckle on my arm. Why was I having such trouble with here? Here in Houston worked well enough, and so did here in the lab, and even here in this part of the lab. But here in the vat always seemed merely an unmeant mental mouthing. I tried closing my eyes while thinking it. This seemed to help, but still I couldn't manage to pull it off, except perhaps for a fleeting instant. I couldn't be sure. The discovery that I couldn't be sure was also unsettling. How did I know where I meant by here when I thought here? Could I think I meant one place when in fact I meant another? I didn't see how that could be admitted without untying the few bonds of intimacy between a person and his own mental life that had survived the onslaught of the brain scientists and philosophers, the physicalists and behaviorists. Perhaps I was incorrigible about where I meant when I said here. But in my present circumstances, it seemed that either I was doomed by sheer force of mental habit to thinking systematically false indexical thoughts, or where a person is, and hence where his thoughts are tokened for purposes of semantic analysis, is not necessarily where his brain, the physical seat of his soul, resides. Nagged by confusion, I attempted to orient myself by falling back on a favorite philosopher's ploy. I began naming things. Yorick, I said aloud to my brain, you are my brain. The rest of my body, seated in this chair, I dub Hamlet. So here we all are. Yorick's my brain, Hamlet's my body, and I am Dennett. Now, where am I? And I just thought that that is so fun and creative and a great read. And again, it's really not long. So if you were interested in that, as it goes on, it gets more and more tangled and more unclear where Dennett is. And eventually it sort of devolves to such an extent that I think another thing that's going on in this piece is Dennett sort of pointing out the limits of thought experiments, of how useful thought experiments can be. And I also found that really fun. So if you're interested in reading that, it's a really short read. I have put a link in the description for you, and you can just have some fun with it, give it a read, and see that maybe philosophy is not so boring as a lot of people assume it to be. So that was one of my favorite pieces that I've read lately. The next book that I kind of wanted to talk about is Carl Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller. I'm actually maybe going to make an entire separate video on this book as well. So I didn't want to talk about it for too long, but I thought I would just touch on it just for completion's sake, and because I think a lot of people probably don't want to watch an entire video on this one really short book. So I'll just sort of give you the gist of my take. So this is a book about a 16th century miller named Minocchio, who was possessed of a number of heretical beliefs highly intolerable to the Catholic Church. So much so that he was brought in for questioning by the Roman Inquisition twice. The first time he was sentenced to life in prison, but because of good behavior and seemingly repenting all of his heretical beliefs, that punishment was commuted after about 2 years. But he was brought in a second time for questioning after he sort of relapsed, I guess. And after that one, after that trial, he was put to death, and he was actually executed for his beliefs. So we have a pretty unique setup here, because not only are we looking at these interviews with this person, Minocchio, but actually because the interviews are about his private beliefs, the Roman Inquisition asked him in quite a bit of detail. They kept quite detailed records about every book that he had read, or every book they could manage to get him to admit he had read. So it's a very unique situation, because it seems tantalizingly possible to sort of create a genealogy of thought here. We can see what things has Minocchio read, how is that reflected in what he says that he believes, and what can we glean about the culture of the 16th century Italy from what Minocchio says. And It's a very interesting hook. There's something about it that's a little bit similar to the last book I read for Historathon, which was Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. There are certain similarities, I think partly in the tone. There's a sort of playful, kind of irreverent tone to both of them. You can kind of tell that they're both written around the same time in the 1970s. There's something in the air with both of these. And both of these books try to sort of examine the life of a single individual in order to show something larger about the culture around them. But I think that's where the similarities sort of end. Tuchman is looking at someone who is astonishingly present at almost every single important happening or event during his time in the 14th century. Enguerrard de Coucy is absolutely emblematic of his time period, utterly orthodox, one might say. Whereas Minocchio is literally a heretic. He's highly eccentric and idiosyncratic. Minocchio is just Minocchio. So I think Ginzburg has a more difficult task in trying to glean what he can about culture from someone who's just utterly unrepresentative of his time, or so we might think at first blush. And I do think that where Tuchman is sort of encyclopedic, Ginzburg is sort of looking at things with a magnifying glass. Most of the book is just his combing through these trial records or these records of interviews with Minocchio. And I think, when you take on something sort of that difficult, daring experiments may be necessary. Unorthodox means of trying to look at the text may be necessary. I think overall, I did have some reservations about the methodology of this book, which really held me back from being able to totally enjoy it. I have a lot of thoughts on this book, but I don't want to get really into the details of it. I'll just sort of more broadly say that I feel that in a lot of ways, this book is not a thesis that Ginzburg is sort of exploring, but actually an explication of a foregone conclusion he's come to. So while we're reading the book, he's sort of making a claim that, okay, we can look at these books that Minocchio read, and those are representative of the elite culture of his time, the written word. When we look at what Minocchio says in the interviews, those places in which he's heretical can represent two things. They can represent Minocchio's sort of eccentricities and idiosyncrasies, but they can also reflect this sort of lost to us, invisible oral peasant culture that existed at the time that also influenced Minocchio's thought. So in those places where Minocchio sort of reads against the grain of the books that we know he read, where he takes a different lesson from those books than was intended, that might represent or tell us something about the oral peasant culture that existed at the time. Now, I think this is quite difficult. It's very difficult to tell the difference between what's Minocchio and what's the oral peasant culture. And because Ginzburg has certain commitments ahead of time, I think, for what conclusion he kind of needs to come to, he never really resolves he never really resolves how he's going to make this distinction. And honestly, it's a lot of it is sort of his intuition or what he thinks is clearly happening. Minocchio contradicts himself all the time, which is another difficulty. And Ginzburg just sort of glosses over that and just says, well, we know that, he was lying to people here and this was what he really thought. I was totally convinced by that. A lot of times the evidence in the book is thin, I would say, quite thin. And I think the reason why is because Ginzburg wants to find a few things, and he's fairly open about that fact. But on the one hand, he wants to find, and he's determined to find, that peasants during this time were not merely passive recipients of elite culture, but instead he sort of wants to give them the dignity of having their own intellectually interesting current of oral peasant culture, which was parallel to the elite culture. They weren't merely, there wasn't merely this like sort of hierarchical society in which there was this trickle down culture from elite to peasant, but instead the peasants were themselves part of cultural production. And then at the end of the book, sort of kind of out of nowhere, with honestly not even an attempt at defending this thesis, he also sort of asserts that not only that, but that there was a trickle-up effect, that somehow the peasant culture was trickling up to the elites, which he never even really discusses. He just sort of throws that in at the end. And those things may very well be true, and they certainly sound nice, particularly to the someone who might be part of the counterculture of the 1970s, but I do feel that it wasn't shown in the book. We feel that Ginzburg sort of starts with that assumption, and then he uses Minocchio as a means of sort of demonstrating what he already knows, or at least that's the feeling one gets from the book. And I have like a lot of reservations with this book that I won't go over, but I do still think that it's an important and interesting book, and one that's well worth reading, if for no other reason than, number one, Minocchio is a really, really interesting figure, a really interesting historical figure. If I were to articulate another one of my reservations with the book, I would say that Ginzburg is continually trying to justify to us why we're learning about Minocchio, that it's going to tell us all this stuff about peasant culture and so on. Whereas I think that we don't even really need that apparatus. Minocchio is interesting in and of himself, and we don't need a justification or a rationalization for why we're interested in Minocchio. He's just interesting, like a number of historical figures are interesting in his own right. So it's interesting to read for that reason, and it's also interesting to read sort of as part of the history of historiography that I think. This slots in very nicely with microhistory, which is part of sort of the history of mentalities, part of the Annales school from France in the mid-20th century. And it's sort of become a kind of, canonical isn't really quite the right word, but an important work in understanding how research in history has evolved over time. And also, I mean, these are just my impressions. I encourage you to read for yourself, see if you disagree with me, and see how you like the book. I think it is a pleasant book to read. I just sort of felt that I didn't always agree with the way that Ginzburg was going about it, and I could go on and on about that, but I'll save you the the headache of that. So the next book I wanted to go over was Simone de Beauvoir, or Beauvoir's All Men Are Mortal. And this is another book I've been having some trouble with, and I think it's kind of why I've been sort of dragging my feet in my reading lately. It's a book about, well, it starts off with a rather vain and sort of vainglorious, one might say, actress, Regina, who is obsessed with becoming famous and having her name live on and having a great long legacy. And she meets a man who's actually immortal. His name is Fosca. And they kind of fall into this sort of ill-suited partnership where each one falls in love with the other in order to use the other. So Regina wants to be with Fosca because she thinks this is her ticket to immortality. He'll remember her forever. Fosca wants to be with Regina because he wants to remember sort of how to be a human being again, and she's sort of taking him back into the world of mortals again. I've just had so much trouble with this book because it sounds so interesting, but the characterization is terribly thin, tissue paper thin, but more so than that, people just act very unnaturally in this book, to the extent that it's not actually that interesting to see how they respond to things like immortality, because it's just they're so much not sort of human. It's very dialogue based. You feel very much that it's sort of movie based. It feels a lot like reading a lot of movie dialogue. People are just sort of continually having tantrums all the time and flipping out and having these emotional outbursts, and it's just sort of you're sort of careening from one shouting match to the next, And it just doesn't feel authentic to me, or like I'm really exploring sort of a human side to what immortality would actually bring. I actually have here an excerpt so that I could share with you sort of how the entire book is very dialogue based, and how it's very sort of disjointed in a way, the way that it's written. So in this excerpt, Fosca and Regina are sitting down to dinner with Regina's sort of maid / number one fan, who is supposed to give Fosca the finest wine, but doesn't want to give it to him because he doesn't seem to appreciate any of the fineries of life. And Regina is just very bothered because Fosca is in any way agreeing with her maid, and she's very, very jealous. She wants all of Fosca's attention to always be on her. So here it begins. They're sitting down to dinner. He sat down and took an olive from an oval dish. Regina poured some port in her glass. "It's not the old port," she said angrily. "No, it's not," Annie confessed. Regina grabbed the glass and emptied it into the fireplace. She walked deliberately over to the cabinet and took out a dusty bottle. "Can you tell an old port from an ordinary port?" Annie asked Fosca. "I don't know," he replied apologetically. "There, you see?" Annie exclaimed. Regina slowly tilted the old bottle and filled Fosca's glass. "Drink it up," she said. Then, turning to Annie, "How on earth can you be so stingy? I detest stinginess." "Do you?" Fosca asked. "Why?" "Why?" Regina laughed weakly. Are you stingy?" "There was a time when I was." "I'm not stingy," Annie protested with a wounded expression on her face. "But I think it's a shame to be wasteful." "I remember the joy of seeing everything in its place, every second, every gesture," he said. Sacks of wheat were piled up in attics. Even the smallest grain felt heavy. Annie listened to him with a stupid, flattered look, and the blood rushed to Regina's cheeks. "I can understand thriftiness, but not miserliness. You can want something with all your heart, but as soon as you have it, you ought to be free with it." "Oh, but you're not free at all with your things," Annie said. "Me? Well, just look." She took hold of the old bottle of port and emptied it in the fireplace. "Sure," Annie sneered, "port, but the day I broke one of your ugly masks did you tear into me?" Fosca watched the scene with interest. "Because it was you who broke it," Regina's voice trembled with anger. "But I can break them all to pieces right this moment." She grabbed one of the masks that was hanging on the wall. Fosca, who had gotten up, went over to her and gently took hold of her wrist. "What good would it do?" he smiled. "I knew that too, the will to destroy." And so the entire thing is sort of written like this, in this sort of melodramatic style where you can practically hear the transatlantic accents. It just seems very movie-based, very disjointed, and sort of these short, punchy sentences, which I guess could be good in some contexts, but it's just sort of tiring when it's every sentence. And these people just don't, I don't know, they don't really seem to act like people. They're a little too archetypal for me. There are a few amusing things about the book. I think the thing that I've been the most amused by is, most of the time in popular culture, when you hear something, when there's a story about immortals, they're usually vampires, and they're very sophisticated and very wealthy and, sort of decadent and languorous and cool. And what I love about Fosca is he's utterly bland. I mean, actually, one of Regina's problems with him is that he's so bland and he has no opinions on anything. He's terribly poor, and all he wants to do is menial labor all day long. She sort of tries to convince him to write a play or something, or do something artful with this amazing knowledge he has of having lived for generations. And he just wants to sort of sweep floors and do manual labor, which I think is really hilarious. In terms of stories about immortality, I do think Borges's short story entitled The Immortals is a much more interesting exploration of immortality. But I also kind of feel like I haven't really given it enough of a shot. I mean, that's kind of why I don't want to put it down yet, because it begins shortly with Regina and Fosca's relationship, but then after a while, Regina just sort of asks him, can you tell me about your previous lives? Like, what was your life like? When did you become immortal? And Fosca sort of starts in on this long explanation of his life, and it begins in sort of early modern Italy or whatever. And I think it's probably going to be the rest of the book that Fosca is just sort of going to be monologuing about his life. And I haven't really read that much of that part of it, but it seems like it might be quite different from the beginning of the book. So I feel like I shouldn't put it down yet, and I should give it more of a chance. But I'm just having such a hard time getting through it that I've just been really dragging my feet on it and really slow. And that's kind of how I end up in these in trouble in a way, because I start picking up other things to read, but I don't allow myself to take on any really big projects because I'm still supposed to be reading this other book. So I pick up these smaller projects, and I think that might be why I'm sort of having a little bit of a slump in reading. It's just that I'm sort of feeling a little bit stuck. But I did read two other pieces while sort of avoiding finishing All Men Are Mortal. And one is a Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller Jr. And this was a pretty interesting one to pick up for me because it's actually science fiction, which isn't really like a usual for me. And this book has also had just like a really long cultural legacy, especially in pop culture, that I thought was interesting. So, it's a post-apocalyptic story. It was originally 3 short stories that have been sort of fused together, and it has a very distinct tripartite structure. And I think it sort of takes place over about 1,500 years. And after each part, we sort of fast forward 500 years. So it begins 500 years, I guess, or so after nuclear fallout, where the Earth just gets destroyed. And apparently it inspired or rather popularized that word fallout, and those Fallout video games were inspired by this very book, which I thought was pretty interesting. So it's takes place 500 years in the future, and we sort of do these time jumps, and we're sort of following this monastery. It's actually specifically a Catholic monastery through these 1,500 years. And this particular monastery is charged with guarding all of the old writings and books that were left over from the before times, before the nuclear fallout. And what pieces remain, they after not only nuclear fallout, but after this sort of anti-intellectual iconoclastic push in which all the books and everything were burned, they've taken it upon themselves to try to preserve all of that knowledge. So in the first part, it's kind of like the Dark Ages lived again. There's no reading or technology of any kind, and they're just sort of devotionally protecting these pieces of writing they don't understand. And then in the middle section, we kind of go through like a scientific revolution. And then in the last section, we're again at a space age, a nuclear age, in which it seems that nuclear fallout is a danger once again. And so I think the setup is really interesting. I also really I think that it's specifically the Catholic Church, that there's this tie to the old world that still exists. It's not a new church, but it's actually the continuation of this church from before. And I do like that the book takes religion seriously. It's not sort of hostile to religion. I think a lot of science fiction that I've been exposed to can be very anti-clerical, and there's nothing wrong with being anti-clerical, but it's sort of sort of dismissive out of hand, rather than trying to grapple with this cultural heritage that much of the world does have, which is religious faith. So I think it's a really interesting meld of religion, old deep-seated culture, and science fiction sort of prognostication. And I thought that was interesting. And I think I just wanted more from this book. It's quite short. And I think I kind of wanted him to just flesh it out more. I wanted to see more, particularly of the scientific revolution. I was really excited to see the Dark Ages end and us come into sort of like a Renaissance or something. But he just kind of gives you tastes of things. He is quite suggestive. You have to sort of use your imagination. And I think also the idea of cyclical time, that we just sort of redo the same mistakes over and over again, because the seed of our greatness is also the seed of our own destruction. The very knowledge that the Catholic Church, that this monastery has protected for so long against destruction, is also sowing our own destruction. That's all quite poetic and satisfying and interesting. I guess I just wanted more. I didn't want to read 3 short stories. I wanted to read something broader. But in a way, I think not getting too detailed and being suggestive and allowing people to use their imagination also preserves a certain kind of subtlety to it that I think is satisfying. And I thought it was a really interesting read, especially since I don't read a lot of science fiction. So I thought that all was pretty interesting, but just too quick, I would say, too quick of a read. And moving on to the last piece that I've read in full is a 1-act play by Oscar Wilde, Salome. And I didn't actually know much about this play before I randomly read it, but I had no idea that it had such a effect on popular culture, on Oscar Wilde's life. It has this huge outsized, for how short it is, it has this outsized reputation and legacy. But I think that's not so surprising when you know what it's about, because it's a highly provocative story. So it's based on the story that may be familiar to many of us from the Bible, in which Herod's wife hates John the Baptist. And when her daughter dances for Herod very well at some sort of function or party or something, and Herod says, that was wonderful dancing. You can ask one thing from me, anything you want, even up to the half of my kingdom. I'll give you anything you want for how well you danced. Herod's wife, it's just easier to use the name Salome. I was trying to avoid it because she's not actually named in the Bible, but nevertheless, Herod's wife's daughter is Salome, and I believe Herod's wife is Herodias. So Salome runs to her mother, Herodias, in the biblical story and says, "Mother, what should I ask for?" And she says, "You must ask for John the Baptist's head on a silver platter." And it was seen to be quite taboo to execute a holy man. And so Herod is shocked, but because he vowed it, he does do it. And the head of John the Baptist is brought in on a silver platter. That's all that the biblical story says. Oscar Wilde really reimagines the story in a quite shocking way. It's amazing to me that this is from the very last few years of the 19th century, but nevertheless the 19th century. It's a story absolutely charged with lust and sexuality to an extent that I don't think I've ever seen from 19th century writing. So in Oscar Wilde's retelling, Herodias is not the main actor, but Salome is. So in Oscar Wilde's retelling, Salome is the most gorgeous princess in the world. She's absolutely beautiful. And Herod is, she's not Herod's natural daughter. She's the daughter from Herodias's previous marriage to actually Herod's brother. So Herod keeps looking at Salome with desire. Herodias, his wife, also hates John the Baptist because, as is the case in the biblical story, John the Baptist continually preaches that their marriage is illegitimate because Herodias was previously married to Herod's brother, so it's incestuous. So Herodias has a chip on her shoulder and hates John the Baptist. So Salome, in her innocence, goes into the courtyard and sees that John the Baptist is being kept captive by Herod, but untouched, unharmed. She sees John the Baptist and immediately falls in love with him. And I wouldn't really say love, she's infatuated. and it's very, very sexually charged. She is in lust. She must have him. And the sheer aggression of her lust from a woman is something I haven't seen in writing this old. And also just the very notion of such a sexually charged situation with a saint, that a saint is so placed in such is so sexualized. He's seen to be absolutely beautiful. She loves everything about his face and all this, his lips and so on. It's absolutely shocking even today. So of course Salome immediately tries to seduce John the Baptist, but John the Baptist, being a saint, refuses her entirely, and it's the rejection that enrages her, and she says, "I will have you." So Herod comes out into the courtyard, continually looks at Salome with desire, and eventually demands that she dance for him. And he says beforehand that if you dance for me, I'll give you anything you want, anything up to the half of my kingdom. So Salome, against her mother's wishes, dances, and she dances what Oscar Wilde terms the dance of the seven veils. And it's not detailed at all what that entails. And people became absolutely fascinated by what this could be. And that is part of what kicked off what was later termed Salomania, after Salome came onto the scene, where lots of people tried to reimagine what this dance could be. And some people even think that that's the origin of the modern striptease, because many people sort of thought that it had something to do with wearing seven veils and slowly removing them or whatever. So she dances this dance of the seven veils. We don't know what it is. Only Oscar Wilde knows. And Herod is so amazed that he says, "Yes, I'll give you anything." And Salome, without consulting her mother, this is entirely Salome's doing in this particular telling by Oscar Wilde, says, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter." And Herod says, "Oh, no, you monster, you monster." And she says, "That's what I want." And she won't take money, she won't take jewels, she won't take anything but the head of John the Baptist. So it's done. John the Baptist is beheaded. And in sort of a horrific moment, Salome picks up the head of John the Baptist and she says, "I will kiss you." And she kisses the lips of John the Baptist beheaded. And it's sort of horrific and horrible, and it's just something I've never quite seen before. It's this sort of aggressive sexuality, this threatening, domineering sexuality on the part of this young princess, and she's termed a monster by Herod. I thought all of that was quite radical. The writing is nothing special, I would say. Like, there's nothing. It's only one act. It's very, very quick, and it sort of just flies by quickly. But the actual content is really radical. I mean, and it was interesting to read a little bit around, sort of what happened with Salome. It very much enters into the Oscar Wilde story, if you're familiar with it at all. Oscar Wilde originally published it in French, and Beauvoir, the young man who would ultimately become the source of his undoing, essentially, actually translated it into English. And he did such a terrible job that it became really controversial among Wilde's friends, and it fed in directly, apparently, into one of their falling outs and separations that Beauvoir and Wilde had. And apparently it was terrible. His French was apparently really, really bad, to the extent that even at some portions he translates incorrectly. So I think at one point one of the lines is, "We should only look in mirrors." And I think Beauvoir wrote something like, we should never look in mirrors," or something like that. So Wilde had to redo a lot of the translation himself, but he left Beauvoir's name on the cover as a olive branch. So it still says translated by, what was his real name? Lord Alfred something. So I thought that was interesting. It was also banned for a time in England, but it kept being performed on the continent. And apparently when Oscar Wilde was in jail, it was some solace to him to know that Salome was being performed still abroad. And yeah, it led to obviously Strauss's opera by the same name, and it just had this long, long afterlife that I think was very interesting. And I think the whole idea of Salomania and coming up with the different interpretations of the Dance of the Seven Veils is very interesting to me. So I thought that was fun. And just read it. It's very short. You should read it. It's short and it's shocking, especially the vicious ending in which she kisses the mouth of the beheaded saint was even for me in a contemporary setting was whoa shocking. So and so that's kind of the what I've been reading while I've been avoiding All Men Are Mortal. And I just have one more book to cover that I'm still in the process of reading, which is an interesting one. It's actually a book by a popular YouTuber, science math YouTuber, and it's called A Guide to Making Friends in the Fourth Dimension. And it's sort of a fun, Flatland inspired little story about which allows you to explore what it's like to live in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions and then eventually 4 dimensions. So it's written a little bit like a children's book, and we explore these little people and what it's like for them to live in a 2-dimensional world. And so here's an example where she's talking about how actually if you're in a 2-dimensional world, if you're wearing a baseball cap, you can't actually ever turn it backwards. All you could ever do is sort of turn it upside down because you're on this one plane. So she talks about how it would be a special gift to for us to come into this plane and flip the hat so that the 2-dimensional being can have a backwards cap. Stuff like that, where you just sort of think about the implications of living in a 2-dimensional world where, for instance, if you open the door of your house, what keeps the house from falling down because the door has been opened and there's just a big gap and the house will just fall down. Things like that. And it seems I'm so far only in Twosville, which is the 2-dimensional part, but we apparently will work through 3 dimensions, and then with that scaffolding of 2 and 3-dimensional thought, I think the goal is to eventually be able to think a little bit about what a 4th dimension might be like. And it's not time. She specifically says, I want to talk about 4 spatial dimensions, not time. So I think that's really fun. I'm reading it really slowly just because you only kind of want to read a couple pages at a time because it's kind of written like a little children's book and it's just fun. And then for a real book that I'm reading, I've recently picked up George Eliot's Adam Bede. And so far that's really promising. I really like that we have sort of a story about non-aristocratic people that's not merely about the fact that they're not aristocratic. It's not entirely about the fact that they're poor. It's also really interesting. It has a female preacher right at the beginning. This is supposed to be, I believe, 1799, so that's interesting. It's just very, very different. So it's very promising and interesting so far, and I'm excited to see where that might lead, and maybe it'll get me to move beyond the slump that I find myself in. And I may or may not continue with All Men Are Mortal. We'll see. I feel like I owe it to Simone de Beauvoir to try to give it a fair shake, though. So I will try that. But anyway, that's all I really had to talk to you guys about today. So I'll see you guys in the next one. All right. Bye-bye.